For decades, we thought we knew exactly how humans first arrived in North America. The story was simple, neat, and taught in every textbook across the continent. People walked across a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska about 13,000 years ago, then spread south through an ice-free corridor between two massive glaciers, case closed. Archaeologists built entire careers on this model. Museums designed exhibits around it. Textbooks presented it as settled fact. The Clovis first hypothesis dominated North American archaeology for over 60 years, and challenging it was considered professional suicide. But in 2019, a team of scientists extracted DNA from ancient soil deep inside a frozen cave in the Yukon Territory. What they found didn't just challenge that story, it completely shattered it. The DNA proved humans were living in the far north of Canada thousands of years before that ice-free corridor even existed, which means everything we thought we knew about the peopling of the Americas was wrong. And the implications go far beyond just rewriting a single chapter in a textbook. This discovery forces us to reconsider who the first Americans were, how they survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and what other secrets might be hiding in the frozen ground beneath our feet. If you're fascinated by how ancient DNA is rewriting human history, hit subscribe. Every week, I break down the latest discoveries that challenge what we thought we knew about our ancestors. Now let's dive into what happened in that Canadian cave. The Bluefish Caves sit in northern Yukon, about 54 kilometers southwest of the village of Old Crow. They're not impressive from the outside. 3 small limestone caves carved into a hillside overlooking the Bluefish River. The kind of place you'd walk right past if you didn't know what you were looking for. No grand entrance, no sweeping vistas, just 3 dark openings in a rocky slope surrounded by scrubby vegetation and permafrost. The largest cave extends only about 16 meters into the hillside. The other 2 are even smaller. In summer, the caves offer shelter from rain and mosquitoes. In winter, they provide minimal protection from winds that can drop temperatures to 50 below zero. But these caves have been controversial in archaeology circles for over 40 years, and their modest appearance hides one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. Back in 1977, a Canadian archaeologist named Jacques Cinq-Mars started excavating the caves. What he found seemed impossible at the time. Stone tools, butchered animal bones, evidence of human activity dating back 24,000 years. The problem was that this timeline contradicted the dominant theory of human migration into North America, the Clovis first model. According to that model, humans couldn't have been in the Yukon 24,000 years ago because the entire region was buried under ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada. The Cordilleran ice sheet blanketed British Columbia and the Yukon. These glaciers were kilometers thick in some places, advancing and retreating over tens of thousands of years. There was no room for humans, no way to survive. The archaeological community largely dismissed Cinq-Mars's findings. His methods were questioned. His dating techniques were challenged. Critics claimed the bone modifications he attributed to human butchering were actually caused by carnivores chewing on carcasses. They suggested the stone tools might be natural rocks broken by freeze-thaw cycles, not human craftsmanship. His career suffered. For decades, the Bluefish Caves remained a footnote in the migration debate, mentioned only as an example of questionable evidence. Cinq-Mars became an outsider in his own field, defending work that most of his colleagues refused to take seriously. But Cinq-Mars never stopped believing in what he found. He continued publishing papers, attending conferences, presenting evidence that most archaeologists ignored. And in 2017, after his death, a new team of scientists decided to take another look at the Bluefish Caves using modern technology that didn't exist in the 1970s. They brought something revolutionary to the table: ancient environmental DNA analysis, also called ctDNA. Instead of looking for bones or artifacts, they were going to extract DNA directly from the frozen sediment layers inside the caves. This technique had never been used before to study human migration in North America. The concept was borrowed from climate science, where researchers had been extracting ancient plant DNA from lake sediments to reconstruct past ecosystems. But applying it to human archaeology was untested territory. The team included geneticists, archaeologists, and climate scientists from universities across Canada, Denmark, and the United States. Leading the effort was Dr. Eske Villerslev from the University of Copenhagen, one of the pioneers of ancient DNA research. His lab had successfully extracted DNA from permafrost samples in Siberia and had proven the technique worked in frozen environments. They carefully collected sediment samples from different layers of the cave floor, each layer representing a different time period. The deepest layers were the oldest. The shallowest were the most recent. The stratigraphy was clear, distinct bands of sediment, each with different colors and textures, stacked like pages in a book. The team used sterile tools to collect samples, wearing full protective gear to prevent contamination from modern DNA. Each sample was handled with extreme care to avoid contamination. They were frozen immediately and shipped to specialized laboratories in Copenhagen, where the DNA extraction would take place. What they were looking for were tiny fragments of genetic material left behind by humans and animals who used the caves thousands of years ago. When humans live in a space, they shed DNA constantly. Skin cells, hair, saliva, waste. Urine contains cells from the urinary tract lining. Feces contain intestinal cells. Even breath leaves microscopic droplets on surfaces. All of it contains genetic markers that can survive in frozen conditions for tens of thousands of years. The key is the permafrost. When organic material freezes quickly and stays frozen, the DNA molecules inside don't degrade as rapidly as they would in warmer climates. The same is true for animals. Every creature that entered the caves left genetic traces behind. The scientists wanted to know not just if humans were there, but when they were there, and what animals were living alongside them. The climate record from ice cores and pollen analysis told them that the Yukon went through dramatic environmental shifts over the past 30,000 years. Sometimes it was relatively warm and dry, with temperatures reaching above freezing in summer. Other times it was a frozen wasteland where nothing grew and survival was nearly impossible. If they could match human DNA to specific time periods, they could figure out exactly when people were living in the region and what conditions they faced. The DNA extraction process took months. The sediment samples were processed in ultra-clean laboratories designed to prevent any modern contamination. These weren't ordinary labs. They operated under positive air pressure, meaning air flowed outward from the lab to prevent outside particles from entering. Researchers entered through airlocks, wearing full-body suits, masks, and gloves. Every surface was sterilized with UV light before work began. The level of precaution was extreme because a single contaminating cell from a modern human could ruin an entire sample. The scientists used a technique called metagenomic sequencing, which allows them to identify thousands of different species from a single sample. Unlike traditional DNA analysis that targets specific genes, metagenomic sequencing reads everything in the sample. Every fragment, every species, every genetic marker, whether it comes from bacteria, plants, animals, or humans. They weren't just looking for human DNA. They were building a complete picture of the ancient ecosystem. Mammoths, horses, bison, caribou, wolves, bears, ground squirrels, birds, insects, plants, fungi, even bacteria. Every organism that lived in and around the caves left genetic traces in the soil. The DNA fragments were incredibly small, often just 50 to 100 base pairs long. For context, the full human genome contains about 3 billion base pairs. These fragments were like finding individual letters from a destroyed library and trying to figure out which books they came from. The team sequenced millions of DNA fragments from each sample and compared them against massive genetic databases to identify the species. It was like solving a jigsaw puzzle with thousands of pieces, except most of the pieces were incomplete, and some didn't match anything in the database. Unknown species, extinct lineages, genetic sequences that existed nowhere in modern populations. Then came the breakthrough. In sediment layers dating to between 14,000 and 24,000 years ago, they found human DNA. Not just traces, clear, unmistakable genetic markers of Homo sapiens. The mitochondrial DNA matched modern humans. The nuclear DNA fragments, though incomplete, showed no signs of Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry beyond the trace amounts all non-African humans carry. These were anatomically modern humans, genetically similar to people living today. The same markers appeared in multiple samples from the same time periods, ruling out contamination. This was crucial. If contamination had occurred, the human DNA would appear randomly across all layers, including modern ones. But it didn't. It appeared only in the ancient layers, exactly where it should be if humans had actually been present. The humans who lived in the Bluefish caves weren't passing through. They were there repeatedly over thousands of years. The DNA concentration suggested multiple visits, possibly seasonal occupation patterns, where groups returned to the caves year after year. But here's what made the discovery earth-shattering. According to the Clovis first model, humans couldn't have reached the Yukon until about 13,000 years ago, when the ice-free corridor opened up between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. That corridor was supposed to be the only route south from Alaska into the rest of North America. Before that corridor opened, the theory went humans were trapped in Alaska or hadn't even arrived yet. But the DNA from Bluefish caves proved that humans were living deep in the Yukon at least 14,000 years ago, and possibly as far back as 24,000 years ago, thousands of years before the ice-free corridor existed. This raised an obvious question. If the corridor wasn't open, how did they get there? The answer required rethinking everything about the migration route. Scientists had been so focused on the inland corridor that they overlooked another possibility: the Pacific coastal route. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower than they are today because massive amounts of water were locked up in the ice sheets. At the peak of glaciation around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were about 120 meters lower than present levels. This exposed a vast stretch of land along the Pacific coast called Beringia. The coastline extended much farther out than it does now, creating a strip of ice-free land that ran from Siberia down through Alaska and along the coast of British Columbia. In some places, this exposed shelf was over 100 kilometers wide. Entire river valleys and coastal plains that are now underwater were dry land. Islands that are separated today were connected. The geography was completely different. If humans followed this coastal route, they could have entered North America much earlier than previously thought and bypassed the ice sheets entirely. They would have traveled by boat, hugging the coastline, hunting marine mammals, and fishing in the rich Pacific waters: seals, sea lions, salmon, halibut, shellfish. The coastal ecosystem was incredibly productive, providing year-round food sources that weren't available inland. Archaeological evidence from Japan and Southeast Asia proves that humans were building ocean-going boats at least 30,000 years ago. Island hopping across the Pacific required sophisticated watercraft and navigation skills. If those populations could cross open ocean, they could certainly travel along a resource-rich coastline. The problem with the coastal route theory has always been a lack of evidence. Most of the ancient coastline is now underwater, submerged by rising sea levels after the ice sheets melted. Archaeological sites that might prove the theory are buried under hundreds of feet of ocean, covered by sediment, and impossible to access without deep-sea submersibles. The few coastal sites that have been found are on islands that remained above water or in areas where geological uplift raised the ancient shoreline above modern sea level. But these sites are rare and difficult to date. But the Bluefish Cave's DNA doesn't need coastal sites to prove the theory. It proves humans were already in the interior of North America before the inland corridor opened. That means they had to get there some other way. The coastal route is the only explanation that fits the timeline. Once people reached the coast of British Columbia, they could have moved inland through river valleys and mountain passes, eventually reaching the Yukon. The DNA evidence suggests they did exactly that, and they did it thousands of years earlier than anyone believed possible. Rivers like the Yukon River, the Stikine River, and the Skeena River all flow from the interior to the Pacific coast, creating natural highways for migration. Salmon runs would have provided both food and navigation markers, guiding people upstream into the heart of the continent. The DNA also revealed what animals lived alongside these early humans, and this is where the story gets even more fascinating. The sediment layers from 24,000 Tubun to 14,000 years ago contain DNA from woolly mammoths, horses, steppe bison, and caribou. But it wasn't just these headline species. The genetic analysis also identified extinct species of ground squirrels, lemmings, voles, and birds that no longer exist. This was the Pleistocene megafauna, the giant Ice Age animals that dominated the landscape. These weren't the animals you'd find in the Yukon today. Modern bison are smaller, weighing around 900 kilograms. Steppe bison were massive, reaching 200 kilograms or more. Horses went extinct in North America at the end of the Ice Age and weren't reintroduced until Europeans arrived. The Ice Age horses were stocky, cold-adapted animals about the size of modern draft horses. Mammoths vanished entirely around 10,000 years ago on the mainland, though small populations survived on isolated Arctic islands for another 6,000 years. The humans living in the Bluefish caves shared their world with creatures that no longer exist. And based on the stone tools found by Mars in the 1970s, they were hunting them. Cut marks on mammoth and horse bones showed clear evidence of butchering. Microscopic analysis revealed the marks were made by stone tools, not carnivore teeth. The angles and patterns matched experimental butchering done by modern archaeologists using replica tools. These people weren't just scavenging dead animals. They were actively hunting and processing large game. A single mammoth could provide thousands of kilograms of meat, enough to feed a group through an entire winter. The bones were also used for tools, the hide for clothing and shelter, the fat for fuel and waterproofing. Nothing was wasted. These people weren't just surviving in the Yukon. They were thriving as big game hunters in an environment that would kill an unprepared modern human in hours. The hunting strategies required to take down a mammoth were sophisticated. You couldn't just walk up and stab one with a spear. Mammoths were intelligent, social animals that protected each other. Hunting them required coordination, planning, knowledge of animal behavior, and the right weapons. The stone tools found at Bluefish included projectile points designed to be attached to spears or darts. Some archaeologists believe the atlatl, a spear-throwing device that increases range and power, was already in use. Groups would have tracked herds, identified vulnerable individuals like young calves or sick adults, and used the terrain to their advantage, driving animals into mud, snowdrifts, or narrow valleys where they couldn't maneuver, working as a team to deliver killing blows. Then the real work began. Butchering a mammoth with stone tools could take days. The meat had to be processed quickly in summer before it spoiled, or frozen and stored in winter. The DNA evidence suggests this wasn't a rare event. It happened regularly over thousands of years. The climate data from the same time period painted a picture of what life was like. Between 24,000 and 14,000 years ago, the Yukon was cold. But it wasn't buried under glaciers like scientists once thought. It was a frozen grassland, similar to the modern Arctic tundra but with more vegetation. During the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, the Yukon experienced what scientists call the mammoth steppe ecosystem. This environment doesn't exist anywhere on Earth today. The region was dry because the ice sheets locked up most of Earth's water, and precipitation was rare. Annual snowfall was lower than you'd find in modern Nunavut. The landscape would have looked like the steppes of Siberia, vast expanses of low grasses, sedges and shrubs like willow and birch, dotted with herds of megafauna. Summers were short but productive. The sun stayed above the horizon for 20 hours a day in June, causing an explosion of plant growth. Wildflowers bloomed, grasses shot up, animals gave birth and fattened up for winter. The temperature could reach 15 to 20 degrees Celsius on warm days. Winters were brutal, with temperatures plunging to 40 or 50 degrees below zero and endless darkness. From November to February, the sun barely rose above the horizon. Days were measured in twilight. The wind was constant, driving the effective temperature even lower through wind chill. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. For humans to survive here, they needed advanced technology, sophisticated hunting strategies, and detailed knowledge of the environment. They needed tailored clothing made from caribou or mammoth hide, with the fur turned inward for insulation. Boots lined with grass or fur, mittens, face coverings, multiple layers. Archaeological evidence from Siberian sites of similar age shows people were making fitted, sewn clothing using bone needles and sinew thread. The clothing had to be waterproof, windproof, and able to wick away sweat because moisture would freeze against the skin and cause hypothermia. They needed insulated shelters. The caves provided some protection, but caves alone weren't enough. Inside, people would have built structures using wooden frames covered with hides, creating a shelter within a shelter. Archaeological sites in Siberia and Europe from this period show evidence of semi-subterranean houses dug into the ground for insulation, with mammoth bones, used as structural supports and hides stretched over the top. Fires were essential, not just for warmth, but for cooking, tool making, and psychological comfort. Wood was scarce in the tundra environment, so people burned bone and animal fat as well. Rendering fat from animals and storing it for fuel was a critical survival skill. They also needed the ability to preserve meat for months at a time. In winter, this was easy. The entire landscape was a freezer. Kill a mammoth in October, and the meat would stay frozen until April. In summer, preservation required smoking, drying, or storing meat in permafrost pits. The DNA evidence suggests they had all of this, and they had it 10,000 years before agriculture was invented. This wasn't primitive survival. This was sophisticated adaptation. One of the most intriguing aspects of the DNA findings was what it revealed about the genetic ancestry of these people. By comparing the ancient human DNA fragments to modern indigenous populations, the scientists could trace lineages backward through time. The people in the Bluefish caves belonged to the same genetic group that would eventually spread throughout the Americas. They were the ancestors of modern First Nations people in Canada and indigenous tribes throughout North and South America. Their DNA showed connections to populations in Siberia, confirming that the ultimate origin of the first Americans was Asia. The Bluefish caves DNA proved that the split between Asian and American populations happened earlier than previously thought. The discovery forced archaeologists to reconsider other controversial sites across North America. For years, sites with dates older than 13,000 years were dismissed as errors. But if the Bluefish caves DNA was legitimate, maybe those other sites deserved a second look. Monte Verde in southern Chile, where tools date to at least 14,500 years ago, suddenly looked more credible. If humans were in Chile that early, they had to have entered the continent much earlier. Other sites in Oregon, Texas, and Florida with disputed early dates suddenly seemed more plausible. But the DNA findings also raised new questions. If humans were in the Yukon 24,000 years ago, where did they come from? The land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, known as Beringia, was exposed during the Ice Age, so crossing from Asia into Alaska was geographically possible. Some scientists believe it was the human drive to explore new territories. Others think these early migrants were following the megafauna herds. Still others suggest that climate shifts in Siberia forced populations eastward. Whatever the reason, the people who reached the Yukon were incredibly resilient. They weren't primitive wanderers stumbling into a new continent by accident. They were skilled survivors who understood how to thrive in extreme conditions. The Bluefish Caves discovery also had implications for understanding how quickly humans adapted to new environments. When people first arrived in the Americas, they encountered ecosystems unlike anything in Asia. Yet the DNA evidence shows they adapted rapidly. Within a few thousand years, they had spread from the Arctic to Patagonia. The people in the Bluefish Caves were part of that story. Another revelation from the DNA analysis involved what happened after the Ice Age. Around 14,000 years ago, the climate started to warm. The ice sheets began to retreat. The megafauna populations began to decline, and many species went extinct within a few thousand years. The DNA from the Bluefish Caves showed this transition. The sediment layers from after 14,000 years ago contained less mammoth DNA and more caribou DNA. The ecosystem was shifting from Ice Age steppe to boreal forest. The humans adapted, shifting their hunting strategies and diet. By 10,000 years ago, the Yukon looked much more like it does today, with dense forests replacing open grasslands. The implications for Indigenous communities in Canada were profound. For generations, First Nations people in the Yukon have told oral histories about their ancestors living in the region since time immemorial. Western science suggested they arrived only 13,000 years ago. The Bluefish Caves DNA validated what Indigenous knowledge had been saying all along. Their ancestors had been there far longer. This strengthens their connection to the territory. The Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation welcomed the findings as confirmation of what they already knew. The technology used to analyze the Bluefish Caves sediment is now being applied to other sites around the world. Ancient environmental DNA is revolutionizing archaeology, because it allows scientists to study human history without finding human remains. In many cases, bones and artifacts don't preserve well, especially in environments with acidic soil or fluctuating temperatures. Tropical rainforests destroy organic material within decades, but DNA can survive in sediment for hundreds of thousands of years if conditions are right. Researchers are now using cetaDNA to investigate Neanderthal sites in Europe, early human sites in Africa, and other controversial sites in the Americas. One of the most exciting aspects of this technology is what it might reveal in the future. The Bluefish Caves are just one site in one region. There are thousands of caves and archaeological sites across the Americas that have never been tested for ancient DNA. Some might contain evidence of even earlier human activity. Others might reveal new migration routes or unexpected connections between groups separated by thousands of miles. The Bluefish Caves discovery also highlighted the importance of revisiting old sites with new technology. Jacques Cinq-Mars spent decades defending his work, only to be vindicated after his death in 2017. How many other dismissed sites might hold crucial evidence that was simply ahead of its time? The lesson here is that science is an ongoing process. The Clovis first model seemed unshakable for 60 years. It took genetic evidence to finally break it. As for the Bluefish Caves themselves, they remain a remote and quiet place, accessible only by helicopter or a long, difficult hike. The caves are protected now, recognized as a National Historic Site. Visitors are rare. The landscape looks much as it did when the first humans arrived thousands of years ago. The same river flows below, The same hills rise in the distance, but beneath the surface, frozen in the permafrost, lies the genetic legacy of the people who lived there when mammoths still walked the earth. The first Americans weren't simple migrants following a single path. They were explorers and survivors who adapted to a changing world and left traces in unexpected places. The DNA from the Bluefish caves is proof that the past is never as settled as we think.